Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks, and in this bulletin we'll get you a roundup of stories developing around the world. We start with the day's topic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Western military and diplomatic support has reached its highest level since Crimea was annexed in 2014, as fears swirl over a potential Russian invasion. The top Russian and U.S. diplomats are to speak again amid intense efforts by NATO allies to prevent an invasion of Ukraine and show support for Kyiv. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson heads to Ukraine for talks with President Zelensky, but he misses a call with Russian President Vladimir Putin as he fights for his premiership amid ongoing revelations about Downing Street parties. India unveils a budget of $529.7 billion for the coming fiscal year, stepping up investment on highways and affordable housing to put growth on a firmer footing as the country's economy recovers from the pandemic. Pakistan's former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif submits a 3-page medical report to the Lahore High Court, claiming he may suffer from heart failure or Takotsubo syndrome, and says he is barred from travelling. And food inflation in crisis-hit Sri Lanka hits a record 25% in January, with crop failures and difficulties in financing imports leading to widespread shortages. Amid escalating tensions over the Ukraine conflict, top officials from Washington and Moscow will hold fresh talks today. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will speak to his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. The talks come after a heated face-off at the United Nations Security Council on Monday. We also learned yesterday that Moscow has sent a letter to Washington following America's written response last week to Russia's security demands. So far, no information on the contents of Moscow's response has been divulged. Today's phone call will be the first time that Lavrov and Blinken have spoken since the US and NATO submitted their responses to Russia's demands last week. Both rejected the Kremlin's call for a guarantee that Ukraine will never be permitted to join NATO. US President Joe Biden on Monday said that America is ready for any scenario, given the ongoing build-up of Russian troops at the Ukrainian border. He also said that non-stop diplomacy is now underway in a bid to defuse tensions.
I had a productive talk last week with President Zelensky, and we continue to engage in non-stop diplomacy and to de-escalate tensions and attempt like the devil to improve security for our allies and partners and for all of Europe, for that matter. And today in the United Nations, we've laid out the full nature of Russia's threat to Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the core tenets of a rule-based international order. And we continue to urge diplomacy as the best way forward. But with Russia's continuing its buildup of its forces around Ukraine, we are ready no matter what happens.
The West claims that Russia continues to add to its troop deployment and also is moving a wide range of military equipment towards the country's border with Ukraine. There's also now a substantial Russian military presence in neighbouring ally Belarus. And US officials say Moscow now has the capacity to launch a three-sided invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, in a fresh bid to defuse the crisis, beleaguered British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is visiting Kiev today for talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The two men will discuss Russia's military activity and strategic British support for Ukraine. In a statement, Prime Minister Johnson said that it is the right of every Ukrainian to determine how they are governed. He also said that as a friend and democratic partner, Britain will continue to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of those who seek to destroy it. Earlier, both Washington and London stepped up their efforts to build pressure on Moscow. The US and Britain say they are preparing new, devastating sanctions against people linked to the Kremlin. On Capitol Hill, the US Senate is working on sanctions that could be presented to lawmakers for approval in the coming days. Britain says the sanctions against Russia will be the toughest ever.
This will be the toughest sanction regime against Russia we have ever had, and it is the most radical departure in approach since leaving the European Union. Those in and around the Kremlin will have nowhere to hide. We will make sure that those who share responsibility for the Kremlin's aggressive and destabilising action will share in bearing a heavy cost. Their assets in the UK will be frozen. No UK business or individual would be able to transact with them, and should they seek to enter the UK, they would be turned back.
Responding to the threat of penalties, the Russian embassy in Washington said that Moscow will not back down in the face of US threats. For more on all of this, let's cross live to New York and WION's correspondent Susan Tehrani, who joins me now. Susan, clearly there's going to be an intensity of interest in this conversation that's going to take place between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. What is the United States' aim here? To continue applying pressure to Russia while trying to see if there's any path for a diplomatic defusing of tensions?
The United States has only so many tools in its hand, Simon. As you mentioned, it's made clear that it does not want to send any troops to Ukraine. First of all, it doesn't have the support here in the United States. The American people really don't have the appetite for that. The Biden administration doesn't want to get into that. It doesn't have the commitment on the part of NATO. So that's one aspect of it. The other tool was at the Security Council. That can only go so far, considering the fact that Russia has a veto-wielding power. Then it comes to diplomacy and sanctions, diplomacy being a hallmark of this administration. And then, sanctions again being a hallmark of perhaps this administration and the United States against countries like Russia, if you may. A set of pretty harsh sanctions, if you may. These sanctions that the American officials are preparing for would cut off foreign lending, sales of sovereign bonds, we hear, technologies for critical industries, and the assets of elite citizens that are close to Vladimir Putin. There was talk that they wanted to sanction President Putin himself. It wasn't clear how that would go. But however, the United States will stop short of sanctioning Russia's oil and gas because President Biden said that that would jack up gas prices here in the United States, again, affecting Biden's own standing and the Democrats' own standing here at home with high gas prices, causing really a pinch for the American people. And then we also have 2022 elections coming up. That's something President Biden doesn't want to deal with. However, the Treasury Department also wants to draw up from experience of what the Trump administration did with Iranian banks. And really go after Iranian banks. That's really what's called a game over sanctions, and targeting Iranian banks would basically mean that, Russian banks, as Iranian banks went under, would go on a list of SDN lists, where foreign entities around the world would stop doing business with those banks, and that would really have a huge effect on Russian companies. So those are pretty major developments, and we'll see how far really ultimately the United States would really go with those sanctions.
But there is, Susan, one question that the White House has struggled to answer over the last couple of weeks, and that is why these sanctions are going to have any different impact on Vladimir Putin and his inner circle than the sanctions that Barack Obama introduced against Russia back in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Those sanctions do not appear to have derailed Vladimir Putin's ambitions, at least towards Ukraine. Why does the United States government think that this time round things might be different?
Right, the million-dollar question ultimately, and there are those that argue that if the United States goes ahead with unilateral sanctions, then it really won't have the effect that America wants, and other countries would have to be on board. It would have to be a wide-ranging international effort to sanction Russia, and whether or not the United States would be successful in doing that to the level that it wants to remains up in the air. As we noted time and again, we've talked about it, and it's out there. Vladimir Putin knows this. Europe is really not on board with these draconian-style sanctions against Russia for a myriad of reasons. And also you have other countries really in Asia that are wondering whether or not Russia should be in a position to be under sanctions and not do business with. At the end of the day, they keep drawing the parallels between Iran and Russia. It's not yet clear for countries like Japan, for example, if Russia is Iran and they do want to take that risk or not. But we also do need to take into consideration that once the United States does move forward and really goes ahead and asks Europe and other countries to take these sanctions. I mean, at least we saw with the case of Iran. Most countries will follow, but then again, it has to be international sanctions for it to be effective. It can't be unilateral U.S. sanctions, and I think that's where sort of the buck stopped with Barack Obama, and that's why they weren't so effective.
Yeah, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when the new German Chancellor visits the White House in 5 days' time for conversations that will absolutely be dominated by Ukraine and those sanctions. Susan Tehrani, live for us in New York. Thanks very much indeed for that. Staying in New York because tensions between Russia and the United States over Moscow's troop build-up near Ukraine were on very clear display yesterday at the United Nations Security Council. Both countries accused each other of being provocative. Russia maintained that there was no proof that Moscow is planning military action and blamed the West for hyping the threat of war.
Tensions between Russia and the U.S. over Moscow's troop buildup near Ukraine spilled into the United Nations Security Council on Monday, with both countries accusing each other of provocation. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia said there was no proof Moscow was planning military action against Ukraine and blamed the West for hyping the threat of war.
They themselves are whipping up tensions and rhetoric and are provoking escalation.
U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield countered that it's the threat of Russian aggression that's at issue, not America's desire to deter a military conflict.
Our encouraging diplomacy is not provocative.
What exactly do you think you accomplished at this Security Council meeting?
And at the State Department, spokesman Ned Price was challenged by a reporter about whether the Security Council merely provided another forum for discussion without any action.
The point today, Matt, to come to your question, was to continue to shine a spotlight on what we are seeing.
Did the Security Council actually do anything?
If the criticism is that we are engaging too robustly in diplomacy, that we're being too transparent, that we're being too consistent in what we're saying, that is criticism that we will accept if that's a criticism you want to lodge.
Meanwhile, the U.S. and Britain said they are prepared to punish Russian elites close to President Vladimir Putin with asset freezes and travel bans if Russia enters Ukraine. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called the British warning very disturbing and said it made Britain less attractive to investors and would hurt British companies. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is due to travel to Ukraine on Tuesday, where he said he will urge Moscow to step back from the brink. Also on Tuesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is expected to speak by phone with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
Here in Washington, U.S. President Joe Biden hosted the Emir of Qatar at the White House. The meeting underscored the tiny Gulf state's strategic importance. Qatar hosts the Pentagon's Central Command and a huge air base. And during the Afghanistan evacuation last year, U.S. forces sent about 60,000 Afghans and Americans to transit through the Qatar air base. Doha served as Washington's diplomatic main point of contact with the Taliban. It will also be pivotal to any future conversations with Afghanistan. Biden described Qatar as a good friend and a reliable partner. He recognized Qatar's place in the U.S. military's global footprint and announced that he was designating Qatar a major non-NATO ally. A special status grant will open the door to closer military and commercial ties.
Qatar is a good friend and reliable and capable partner, and I'm notifying Congress that I will designate Qatar as a major non-NATO ally to reflect the importance of our relationship. I think it's long overdue.
So, we're very happy and proud of this great relationship, and we're going to continue working together to find ways and means to bring peace in our region. So thank you very much for, seeing me today, Mr. President. And as you mentioned, that we'll be talking about several topics.
The two leaders also celebrated a $20 billion deal for Boeing. The American plane manufacturer secured a new order from Qatar-U.S. It becomes the first customer for Boeing's new 777X cargo planes. At a White House ceremony, Qatar-U.S. signed a nearly $7 billion letter of intent to buy 25 737 MAX narrow-body airliners.
On that front, I want to applaud the new deal that Qatar Airways Group signed with Boeing for a $20 billion deal. One of the largest deals that Boeing Aircraft has ever had, and it will support tens of thousands of good-paying U.S. jobs here in America.
However, the issue that dominated the meeting was the attempt by the United States to shield European allies from potential Russian energy cutoffs. Western capitals are threatening unprecedented economic sanctions against Moscow, but if the brewing conflict with Russia escalates, there are fears that the oil and gas producing giant could then retaliate against the European Union. The EU imports 40% of its natural gas from Russia and is already facing a steep price crunch. Amid transatlantic tensions over Russia's intentions in Ukraine, Qatar's importance is rising given its energy riches. Qatar is one of the world's biggest exporters of liquid natural gas, and Washington hopes that Doha will temporarily redirect exports destined for Asian markets to Europe if that becomes necessary. The Emir is the first Gulf state leader to visit President Biden since he took up residence in the White House just over a year ago. The Emir also met Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, members of Congress and other officials here. In other news, the United States is again reminding Iran that time is running out for negotiations aimed at restoring the nuclear deal, from which Donald Trump, of course, withdrew America. Urging direct talks to help forge an agreement, a senior U.S. official said that Iran's nuclear program is nearing breakout, the point at which Iran could develop nuclear weapons, and that there are just a few weeks left now to secure a deal. That would put the program on hold and ease sanctions on Iran. The US says Iran's enrichment program is now very close to producing enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon. The latest round of talks in Vienna were put on pause last week, with the EU coordinator calling for political decisions to be made to break the deadlock. On Monday, Iran said that differences with the United States remain over the issues of lifting sanctions and obtaining guarantees in the Vienna talks aimed at reviving the 2015 agreement. Iran reiterated its call for a guarantee that the US will never withdraw from the agreement again. No repeat, in other words, of what President Trump did back in 2018.
Important and significant issues remain regarding the removal of sanctions that have not made an agreement possible so far. In addition to the issue of obtaining guarantees, progress should be made in an acceptable way for Iran so that we can close the file.
The original deal gave Tehran sanctions relief in exchange for curbs on its nuclear program. The Biden presidency helped relaunch negotiations, but Washington has been taking part only indirectly. Now the United States says it's open to direct talks with the Iranians. Reacting to an ongoing Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa demonstrating against vaccine mandates and COVID-19 lockdowns, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says that those participating memory and truth. Trudeau called the protests disgusting and said that Canadians will not be intimidated by them. The Canadian Prime Minister disclosed yesterday that he's tested positive for COVID-19 and has been at an undisclosed location since the truckers' protest began.
This affects us all. 2 of my own children have now contracted it, and this morning I learned I tested positive for COVID-19 as well.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced Monday he was positive for COVID-19, but feeling fine.
I feel well and have no symptoms.
Trudeau, who has championed the vaccine and got inoculated in front of cameras last year, went into isolation last week after one of his children tested positive and said he would continue to work remotely from an undisclosed location. Trudeau's positive test comes as dozens of trucks and other vehicles have jammed up central Ottawa since Friday, and thousands descended upon Parliament Hill to complain about Canada's COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Police said most demonstrators have been peaceful, but local residents complain they are fed up with the non-stop blaring of truck horns. Some also forced a homeless shelter to give them food, the shelter said on Twitter, while others flew Nazi flags. Trudeau on Monday said Canadians were disgusted.
I want to be very clear. We are not intimidated by those who hurl insults and abuse at small business workers and steal food from the homeless. We won't give in to those who fly racist flags. We won't cave to those who engage in vandalism or dishonor the memory of our veterans.
Senior members of the official opposition Conservative Party, which last year lost its 3rd consecutive election to Trudeau's Liberals, have praised the demonstrators. But Ottawa's Mayor Jim Watson condemned what he called the more extreme behavior, saying, quote, "My message to the truckers is you've had your protests, you've had your rally. Time to go back home."
Finally from us today, all over the world we've seen pet ownership grow, especially with pandemic puppies. But now in Australia, youngsters are taking to beekeeping. Their aim is to promote a threatened native species which is small and has no sting in its tail.
Bees as pets sounds strange, but it is a new reality in Australia. Enthusiasts throng up close and personal with some of the country's most important pollinators, but not a stinger in sight.
Look, I was surprised how a lot of people actually didn't know that actually they exist. And as soon as they hear the word stingless, they gravitate towards this and they want to find out a little bit more. And then when they see how gentle they are and tiny, they all want it because it's the best pet.
Australia native stingless bees are quickly becoming the pet of choice. From the more than 2,500 types of native bees found in Australia, these bees are the only species in Sydney that live in a colony and make honey. They are also one of just 12 species that are stingless.
Native bees have been a part of this ecosystem for hundreds of thousands of years, and they face a number of threats, notably habitat loss.
Amateur bee rescuers are stepping in to raise awareness about the bee, hoping education will help boost the bee's popularity. Now more than 100 hives have been installed in backyards, parks and childcare centres in and around Blakehurst. And the Billion Bees Foundation expects many more will continue to come on board.
Kids have a natural inquisitive to actually learn about biology and insects. And when you've got them at your doorstep, you can actually observe them. And then all of a sudden, I've seen with my kids how they're starting to observe not just the bees itself, the stingless ones, but also other type of insects.
The bee may be an unusual pet, but it's doing a lot of good for the environment. Bureau Report, WION, Wild is One.
And it's time for us to buzz off. That's all we have on the Tuesday edition of WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. For more global news and updates, stay tuned to WION World is One.
There are many other... this is right, Arab.
Stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook.
नहीं ये मेरी गाड़ी नहीं है इधर जाना मैं लेट हो जाऊंगा इधर इसकी गाड़ी खराब हो गई है